There's a mystery in the tiny village of Dingley Dell. Someone has stepped on this poor, innocent beetle, breaking her leg, and the town detective slash conspiracy theorist Moulton believes it's this squirrel for some reason. Is she a psychopathic bug murderer, or just an innocent squirrel with a crush? Let's make her, and you can decide for yourself. This is Goblin Girl Studio. Like in any investigation, we need to start with a sketch of the suspect. And, just like in any investigation, that sketch will come completely from my imagination. This little squirrel, Squirrelina, as I'm calling her, has a kind of intense look about her. She's got a lot of enthusiasm, and I think that would present itself with a constantly wide, unsettling stare and a crooked smile. I think that she would probably wear a simple, old-fashioned skirt and a collared blouse with a heavy apron, since she's always working with her hands. And because she's a romantic, a little heart locket around her neck that has a picture of her secret crush. As a carpenter, she does a lot of whittling, so let's put a little knife in her hand that she can enthusiastically gesticulate with while talking to her neighbors. For the colors, I think that blue would look really nice against the rusty browns of her fur. Oh, and she has a bunch of mysterious reddish-brown stains on her apron. Not really sure where those came from. Suspicious? Certainly. But attempted bug murderer? Probably. We'll need more evidence before we can close this case, so let's move on to Exhibit A, the face sculpt. So because she's got this crazed, wide-eyed stare, I can't do my standard technique of just squishing beads into the eye sockets, painting them black, and calling it a day. She needs a little more energy, so that means that she needs posable eyes. To do that, I'm starting with a base of crumpled up tinfoil with 2 anthropomorphic squirrel eye-sized beads squished into it, and then I can sculpt the face like a mask over the top of that. Unlike the moles, mice, and beetles that I've made before, squirrels are actually real, so I was able to go right outside my apartment and study their faces in 3 dimensions for my sculpt. It didn't help. But eventually I got her looking close enough to the misshapen rodents that we all know and love. And now that she is squirrel-ish, I can start adding the details that make her who she is. Like carving out a chunk of her face to give her a weird wobbly smile like she's about to start laughing like this. And I gotta add some little wormies of clay around her eyes to make some eyelids that'll really emphasize her constant unsettling stare. And finally, I can add another wormy of clay into her gaping maw to make some weird little pointy teeth. It's wild, she's the one squirrel in the world that has teeth like this. It's gotta be significant, right? I mean, I am trying to make her look like a squirrel to the best of my ability, but more important even than that for me is wanting her to look alive. Like she has thoughts and feelings and intentions, even if those intentions are slightly concerning. And sometimes the difference between a sculpt looking alive or like a soulless doll seems to be the difference of a millimeter. So I just keep moving the clay around in tiny increments until I look at her and I feel like I can see the light behind her little bead eyes. Okay, maybe that's something only I can see, but it feels real to me. For a final touch, I used this toothbrush from an anonymous donor to add some texture to the nose. They were so anonymous that even they don't know that it was their toothbrush that was used. I mean, how generous is that? I'm feeling really good about this sculpt now, so I bake it and then pull the foil out. Have you ever looked at a squirrel and wondered what was going on inside its head? Well, here you go. It's terrifying. The top of her head is a little thin, and because I exclusively drop things that would make me cry if they broke, I decided to reinforce it with some plumber's epoxy to thicken it up from the inside. But here's my new problem. The clay got around the backside of the eyes and they won't come out. And I want this face to be replaceable so that I can give her other expressions like sad or angry or amorous, so I gotta get them out of here. I take my X-Acto blade and carve out the clay around the eyes little by little until they can be broken free. And finally, I carve out a little space for a magnet so that her face won't just pop off at any given moment. And I love how this face turned out. Doesn't she look like she just has evil intent? But now, let's not be too hasty with our judgment. Let's move on to Exhibit B, the armature. Which is basically like the little wire skeleton that will make this character strong, posable, and give her the ability to commit crimes. I start out by cutting armature wire and copper wire roughly to the lengths of the spine, arms, legs, and tail, grouping those together in little bundles and then lashing them together with thread to fuse their powers. And look guys, I totally figured out a new way to do this that doesn't leave my hands with 1,000 tiny cuts from the jagged wire edges. I muscle them into the shapes I want, which interestingly are not the shapes of a spine, arms, legs, or a tail. Then I can attach them all together with string, which holds it together long enough to set it with super glue and baking soda, which then holds it together long enough to set it with plumber's epoxy. I try to build up the epoxy roughly into the shape of the ribcage and hips so that I have something to make the base of the body shape, and so that I can have something to grab onto when I pose her. Once that's set, I can go in and trim the arm wires to the right length, and then use this interlocking brass tube, elbow grease, and liquid epoxy to make mounts for the, spoiler alert, replaceable hands. So that she can listen out for the detective on her case, let's make some tiny ears. First, they also need little wire armatures so that they'll be posable, and then I add just a little bit of epoxy putty at the tips to make a base for the ears to hold on to. For the ear shapes themselves, I'm using a thermoplastic called Warbla, which when heated can be molded into either little animal appendages or a gooey mess of hot plastic. Let's see which it is today. I just heated up with a hairdryer. I know it's ready when my fingers are about medium rare. And then I can stick the front and back pieces together and shape them into a more rounded, peanutty ear shape around the epoxy base. A little liquid epoxy ensures that they'll stay firmly attached, and now I've got two little similarly shaped ears ready to go on the back of the head. I was so nervous about getting the back of the head stuck inside the face or getting the placement of anything wrong that I did 4 separate rounds of various epoxy putties to little by little build it up, attach the magnets and the ears, and make it all head-shaped. But once that was all set, I could finally do an eye movement test, and it worked. I can't believe I got this movable eye thing to work on the first try. Since when does that happen? Now, how is this squirrel gonna run with scissors without any feet? To make them, I first bend the leg wires into that digitigrade animal leg shape. Yes, I did have to look up the word digitigrade for this narration, and yes, while I was doing that, I did discover that squirrels aren't digitigrade animals after all. Then I got some trail cam footage of me supergluing some T-nuts onto the foot wires since I want to be able to screw her down into a diorama. Because yeah, I do plan to make her lair, cute little tree home at some point. To sculpt her feet, I used the magic that I was granted by the craft gods for finishing one project before starting another to auto-mix this magic sculpt, which is basically like a slow-curing epoxy putty. Then I squish a heaping dollop of that over on top of the foot. I've made enough rodent feet now that I feel like I kind of have it down to a science. I carve the smallest foot shape that I can make around the wires, and then I add 2 lines of clay wormies for the knuckles and smooth those out. Next, I carve out lines in between each toe, really getting that toe jam out of there. And then I cut out little points for the tips of the toes, tapering those down and then defining the nail bed. From there, I just refine the details, use water to smooth things out, and there you go, it's a little squirrel foot. 1 down, 1 to go. While some have said that this squirrel's foot looks nothing like the women's size 8 footprint left at the scene of the crime, at least one person has argued that this squirrel was probably trying to frame someone. The real question is who? While you consider that, let's move on to Exhibit C, foam. This is where a critter really starts to take shape. First she gets a spongy little inner tube to fill out her belly, but help her stay nice and flexible, and EVA pool floaties to reinforce her bones a little bit. And then she just gets completely dunked in barge glue and polyurethane foam, basically cushion foam, until she looks way worse than how she did before. But then comes the fun job of trimming the foam bit by bit, revealing the cute little squirrel underneath. The legs were super satisfying because they basically went from rectangles to actual animal leg shapes. Again, not animal leg shapes accurate to a squirrel, but talking and wearing clothes aren't accurate either. And once I thought I was done, I remembered that her fur and clothes were gonna make her like 20% fluffier, so I trimmed her down even more. With the ugly armature covered, she's finally starting to look like something other than the creature that haunts my nightmares. But now the first step towards catching her red-handed is Exhibit D, making hands. To make posable hands, the first step is another armature. I fold 3 wires in half, then use one of those strands to wrap all the wires together and then make a very rough hand shape. From there, I trim the wires down to just a little bit more than squirrel finger length and loop over the pointy edges. And since I wanted pointy edges after all, I use Magic Sculpt to give her some pointy little nails. Now for the muscles of the hand. I'm using more cushion foam and this special effects balloon latex. I cut out pieces of foam for the top and the bottom of the hand, saturate them with latex, then sandwich the wires inside the foam to make a forbidden Uncrustables sandwich. Then I repeat this process for the fingers. I've got the hands covered, but they're looking a little roadkilly. So to make them a little more 3-dimensional, I add some smaller pieces of foam to build out the palm and the knuckles. I love seeing these little hands come to life. So do you remember those interlocking tubes from earlier? Neither did I, because I totally forgot to attach the smaller tubes onto the wrists so that they can be replaceable. So let's enjoy a little bit more crafting ASMR. and then glue those onto the base of the hands. Finally, we're ready to put some skin on these things. I take the thinnest jar I have, fill it with latex, and then mix in small amounts of acrylic paint until I get to the desired color, which is always way lighter than how it will dry and I somehow never see it coming. And then I just start dunking the hands in. I let the excess run down the hand, helping any little globs along the way that get stuck between the fingers and the palm. I let it dry and then repeat this process, like 6 times per hand. Once the hand latex is opaque enough, next comes the very satisfying job of slicing off all the latex drippings around the brass tubes. And while this may be the skin of a killer, it's not the skin of a killer, so I cut this latex shine down with a dusting of baby powder. Honestly, setting them down on my messy desk seems to do the trick just as well though. And finally, I very carefully cut off the latex around the nails and touch up their paint job. This was really delicate work, but I'm so happy with how these little hands turned out. I think they might just be my best hands yet. So sorry to interrupt this case, but I have a quick channel announcement to make. Today, I'm launching a Patreon. It's a place where I'm going to be sharing actual tutorials because I'm taking like 50 hours of footage and whittling it down to 20 minutes in these videos, so there's a lot that I just don't have time to explain. As well as behind the scenes, bonus content, high-res photos, materials lists and links of where to buy everything, community polls so you can help make decisions on future projects and characters, and of course, your name in the credits of these videos. And lastly, you would receive my eternal gratitude because you'd be supporting this channel and supporting me doing what I love, making more projects and videos to share with all of you. Any of that sounds interesting to you, follow the link in the video description to check it out. Hope to see you there. Back on the case, we're on to Exhibit E, painting. I don't have anything that interesting to say about painting, other than that I first spray a base coat of Mr. Super Clear and then I use cheap craft store paints. So I think it's time that we dive into a character study of this suspect. As the completely unbiased and reliable narrator with no personal connection to this case whatsoever, I owe it to you to give a full account of this squirrel. Squirrelina is a simple squirrel, born the youngest in a litter of 4, none of them ever suspecting the simmering evil that lay just beneath the surface. Showing an early affinity for knives, hammers, and other weapons, she took up the family trade of carpentry and has used those skills to enthusiastically aid other residents of Dingley Dell in a ploy to gain their trust. Frighteningly, Squirrelina is almost never seen without a knife in her hand. In her other hand, there's usually a piece of wood that she's whittling, but the knives are what really stand out to family and neighbors. Most concerning of all is the obsessive project that Squirrelina works on every spare moment that she gets. For years, she's been meticulously crafting a disturbingly accurate miniature scale model of Dingley Dell, along with little carvings of all of its residents. Frightening, I know. But even more concerning is that with them she imagines wild stories of drama, deception, and romance, a venture that some have heard her refer to as shipping. It didn't take much for her to set her unsettling sights on Moulton Burroughs, the local conspiracy-minded detective. She liked how, unlike most of the men in her life, he really seemed to take an interest in her, always asking her questions about herself like, "Where were you on the evening of Thursday the 7th?" or "What would you stand to gain from harming an innocent beetle?" As many as one person believes that her unrequited crush led her to psychologically torturing Moulton by sending him personalized gifts of his favorite treats, saying nice things about him, and asking him to go on picnics with her. Was this heinous crime against his pet bug the final piece of her evil plot? We may never know, but I mean, probably, right? Before we move on, the final thing I have to paint is her eyes. I know originally I had drawn her with these big pupils that filled up most of her eye, but I've gotten kind of attached to the tiny beadhole pupil look, so I think I'll just paint the inside of the hole black and leave it there. It's so simple, but it's really effective. I think this is one of the nicest paint jobs I've ever done for one of these critters, so let's completely cover it up with Exhibit F, fur. First, let's start with the tail because that seems like the hardest part to mess up. I'm taking some of this conveniently tail-shaped fur, gluing it down onto the tail at a few strategic points, and then sewing on a matching piece of fur for the other side. I feel like this seam is really obvious, but if I constantly fluff her tail, that kind of hides it, so I think it's okay. On the back of that victory, I moved on to the legs, which I basically did the same way. I glue a strip of fur onto the front, trim it down, glue one strip onto the back, trim that down, and then go back and forth trimming until they meet in the middle and sew them together. Wow, big boots with the fur energy here in this pre-trimmed look. I continued this process on the forearms and the neck until all the areas that won't be covered in the clothes were furified. Oh, and I glued on little tufts to the back of the hand too to blend them in with the rest of the arm. And now I can work on the face. With this process, I work from the back of the face towards the front, First, gluing down strips of faux fur around the edge of the face, then when that gets too bulky, gluing down tiny tufts of hair bit by bit over the whole rest of the face. This takes forever, and I'm trying to just accept that it's going to look worse before it looks better. It's worked out before, it can work out again. Once she looked like a dog with its head out the car window, I knew she was ready for a haircut. I started with the body, trimming the leg for nearly as short as I could since you won't really see it under the skirt anyway. It's giving mange, but it's fine. You're not really gonna see it. I don't need to redo it. And then I trimmed down the arms and the neck until I got something just a little less wild looking. The face I take nice and slow so I don't over trim. I wasn't really loving how it looks, so I tried to remember that the fur always looks better once it's slicked back, but this time it didn't. She just didn't look alive anymore. And that's the one thing that I just can't let slide, so I ripped all the fur off her face and most of the paint along with it to start again. Honestly, I was overdue for something to go wrong. This project has been going way too smoothly, I had to be stopped. So this time around, I didn't put any strips of faux fur down, just the little tufts, but much less than before, especially around the eyes. Then I trimmed that fur down as much as I could before I pulled out my flocker. This baby uses a static charge to lay down a light perpendicular dusting of hair onto any glued surface. At least, it would have if my batteries hadn't been dead. But, I don't know, even with the fur just kind of glued down as a jumbled mess, it still looks good enough for me to not want to redo this again, so I'll just finish the muzzle off with my now properly electrified flocker. After brushing off the excess and slicking the hair back with water and Mod Podge, I think the fur actually looks pretty good. This brings up another important piece of evidence in the case against Squirrel. Her fur color is an exact match for the hair left behind at the scene of the crime. I mean, yes, the hair was longer, wavy, had subtle remnants of a shag haircut, but it was the same color. And that brings us to Exhibit G, the costume. I don't know if you've all heard, but the largest fabric store chain in the US is on the brink of going out of business, and I think it's because they don't actually sell what the people demand, sewing patterns for squirrel clothes. So that means I have to make my own pattern. Luckily, my client is willing to sit for hours while I get her measurements just right. And now that this pattern is starting to look alright in paper and tape, I can cut it out in fabric. First, I sew the front and the back pieces of the shirt together, leaving the sides open. And now let's add some sleeves. I just add a little pleating at the top to give it a little more, I don't know, something, and then sew them onto the shirt. And for one last step before I can start sewing this shirt onto my squirrel, she needs a collar. And it just so happens that I just learned an amazing miniature collar making technique from my friend Felicia Rose, aka Miss Rose Sews, who's a real professional miniature costume maker for stop motion. I cut a piece of paper into my collar shape, glue it onto the fabric, and iron the seam allowance over the paper so that the edges will be super crisp. And then I just glue it down. The inner edge is left loose to glue onto the rest of the shirt. Collars were my biggest miniature sewing nemesis, but this one turned out so nice and crisp. Oh no, I feel like I'm about to use this technique for absolutely everything now. As posable as she is, her arms don't quite have the flexibility needed to put on a shirt, so I'm just gonna have to sew it right onto her. Once those are on, I make some tiny cuffs for the sleeves by making a little loop of fabric, folding over one edge and gluing it, and ironing down the other edge with this adorable tiny iron that I got for Christmas, and then gluing that to the shirt. I'm obsessed with gluing now. This is like a mini clothes superpower. So, I know that in the original drawing she's in a skirt, but now that I'm seeing her in front of me, that just doesn't feel like her. So I'm changing the plan and making her overalls instead. First, I use fabric glue to secure down the edges of the butthole. I mean, the hole for the tail to go through that's at the butt of the overalls. Oh god. I'm trying to get that kind of turned over double stitched look that you see on jeans, so I faked it by sewing one decorative line through the seam and then another right beside it. With those sorted, now I can add some little cuffs. These were the smallest possible size I could sew by machine. It literally fit right around the presser foot. Next, I want a big pocket in front to put some knives and chisels in. Again, I just cut the shape of the pocket in paper and glue down the edges, throw on some decorative stitches, and then glue it onto the overalls. Ugh, this is so cute. And here's where I maybe got a little too zealous with this paper technique. I did it for the bib of the overalls too. It's maybe too big for this, but I just can't resist those easy, clean corners. Next, I made some butt pockets, and my favorite detail of this entire costume, a little hammer loop. I can't wait to put a tiny rusty hammer in here. Next, I sew some tiny, adorable buttons on the sides of this strip of fabric, then glue the strip down as the waistband. But these buttons weren't quite as adorable when I tried to sew through these leather strips to find their tiny buttonholes while attaching these little overall straps. Look what happened to my needle! Just another casualty of this sick squirrel. There's one last thing to do on these overalls before I can sew them on, and I'm really scared. I have to dirty them up and add the mysterious red stains. And this is something where if I mess this up, I can't undo it. I would have to redo the entire overalls. So, here goes nothing. I start with a dusting of pastels, trying to focus on what areas would naturally be the dirtiest. Probably like the bottom of the pants and the knees, but I'm still getting some schmutz just about everywhere. I'm probably being a little bit conservative with this right now, but I'm sure that the minute I take her outside for photos, she's gonna get plenty dirty. And then for the red-brown stains, I'm painting them on with some watered-down acrylic paint. What do you think? Blood stains or wood stains? I guess that's for forensics to answer. And with that, it's all ready to be sewn onto her. As I sew these overalls around the tail now, I gotta ask you all a big question. Are pants for animals just assless chaps? While you type your answers to that, I'll glue on the back half of the waistband and glue the front sides to the back. Look, it actually looks like it's buttoned on. That's so cute. And finally, I gotta sew the straps down on the back. Oh, these overalls are so cute, but I'm not quite done with this costume yet. Remember in my original design how I said that she has a locket with a picture of her crush? Look what I found! The tiniest locket ever. I can't believe it. It's just the right size and it opens up at everything. This is so small, it was nearly impossible to draw a face at this size. But can you tell who it is? I just throw it on a chain and now she has a little locket necklace. And finally, I had a little scarf tied up around her ears to complete the cute working girl vibe. With that, her costume is done, but I can't help but feel that we're missing one key piece of understanding of this squirrel. Let's take one last dive into the evidence room to see Exhibit H. Personal effects. Because I mean, I have to give her some knives, right? Here, I'm using a mini knife making technique that I learned from watching Queen City Minis videos. I cut shapes of knives, a saw, and chisels from the bottom of a peanut tin, and these are very sharp. They are like legit little knives. See? This squirrel has it out for me. Then I sandwiched their handles with wood and then carved that wood into a more natural rounded shape with another tiny knife. I gave the handles a dark brown wash, and the knives themselves got some aging and a little rust too. And I can't forget the tiny hammer. I carved the handle from a bit of wood and then sculpted the head of the hammer with Sculpey. A little silver paint and some aging rounds out the look. But wait, I gotta put it in this little loop. It's so cute. And finally, you didn't think I was gonna leave you here without making a miniature for a miniature, did you? We gotta make one of her little wood carvings. Bless my heart, I actually tried to carve one in wood, but maybe I need to learn how to carve something a little bit bigger first. Ultimately, I decided to fake it with Sculpey instead. As I make this, there's one more matter to examine, Squirrelina's alibi. At 7 p.m., Patricia Baddington, aka Lady Nocturna, says that she was finishing a psychic reading on love for Squirrelina. At 7:30 p.m., Frogbert and Totalmeyer confirm that she paid them a visit for tea and to make measurements of their new home for her scale replica. As the crime is estimated to have happened at 7:15 p.m., and those two locations are a 29-minute walk apart, that leaves a whole 60 seconds unaccounted for. In that time, it is possible that she sprinted to the scene of the crime, pulled out her stashed human foot-shaped wooden stamp, committed the stomping, restashed her stamp, and ran back to Frogbert and Totalmeyer's house without anyone seeing her. As unbiased and reliable of a narrator I am, I can't help but wonder, what happened in those 60 seconds? But I mean, I wouldn't know. I was home cleaning my craft desk. But this little guy turned out so cute. I can't wait to make a whole miniature town of these. With that, we are ready for one final piece of evidence, the reveal. So what does a bug killer look like? Like this? Like this? Or like this? I think we all know the answer to that. Thanks so much to my very first patron, my partner Jakey, who also did all the music for this video, and my wise sage critter consultant and brave little toaster, Courtney. If you'd like to see behind the scenes or tutorials or contribute to the creation of these characters and future projects through polls, please check out the link to my Patreon in this video's description. If you'd like to see more crafts from me, including more Dingley Dell characters and stories, because I do intend to make the entire village both in miniature and Squirrelina's miniature, please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time at Goblin Girl Studio.